Wyoming Territory, 1882. The evening light slanted low across the valley, turning the dust of Red Rock's single street into a haze of copper and gold. Wagons creaked, horses whickered in their hitching posts, and townsfolk moved with the kind of wary quiet common to frontier places where trouble always seemed only a mile away. At the center of it all stood the Red Rock Saloon, its paint long peeled by wind and sun, its windows streaked with the stains of smoke and spilled beer. Inside, lanterns burned low, and the air smelled of whiskey, sweat, and sawdust. Behind the scarred mahogany counter stood Eli Turner, wiping down glasses with steady strokes of his cloth. His hair had gone gray around the edges, his back carried a stoop that suggested long years of labor, and his face was lined like the desert earth. To most, he was just a barkeep, quiet, forgettable, a man who poured drinks and swept floors until the day he would die in the same town where he had chosen to hide himself. He liked it that way. The saloon murmured with a low hum of card games, dice rolling, boots scraping against wood. A piano in the corner lay silent, its keys untouched since the pianist skipped town 2 months earlier. Eli's world had shrunk to simple things, glass in one hand, rag in the other, bottle behind the bar ready to pour when asked. He'd learned to live in silence, to bury the noise of the past beneath routine. Then the batwing doors slammed open with a force that scattered dust into the lamplight. The sound of spurs rattling on wood followed. 5 men strode in, swagger clinging to them like smoke. They wore pistols low, hats pulled mean across their brows, and the grin of men who carried death like a badge. At their head was Caleb Veric, his lean frame draped in a black coat, eyes cold and glittering like a rattler poised to strike. He walked to the counter and dropped a silver coin with a sharp clink. "Whiskey, old man. And make it quick." The saloon fell to hush. Dice froze mid-roll, chairs creaked as players leaned back slow, and every gaze darted to the counter. Eli picked up the bottle without a word, his hand steady, his cloth tucked into his belt. He poured into 5 chip glasses lined on the bar. But his quiet grace only fed the gang's appetite for cruelty. "Look at him." One jeered, his voice sharp with mockery, hands trembling like a leaf in the wind. Another leaned in closer, smirking with rotten teeth. "Maybe we ought to teach this old crow to flap faster." Laughter spilled from them, rough and mean, filling the saloon with a sound that curdled the air. The townsfolk ducked their heads lower, eyes fixed on cards and tables, hoping the storm would pass over them. No one in Red Rock would rise for the bartender. He was only a man behind a counter. Eli placed the glasses on the wood with a careful thud, one after another, then stood with the whiskey bottle in hand. His voice, soft but unyielding, cut through their laughter like a blade through cloth. "Whiskey doesn't taste right when poured in anger." The words carried weight. For a moment, the bandits blinked, caught off guard. Then the saloon erupted with cruel laughter again, louder this time, echoing off the rafters. Caleb slammed his pistol against the bar with a bang that made the lantern glass shiver. His grin stretched sharp and dangerous. "You trying to sound wise, barkeep? Or just trying to keep your teeth in your head?" Eli looked at him then. He lifted his gaze slow, his pale eyes meeting Caleb's, and for the span of a heartbeat, something in them shifted. They no longer looked old, no longer weary. They gleamed like steel tempered in fire, carrying the kind of memory that spoke of smoke, duels, and men who never walked away. Caleb felt it, that flash of danger, and though he forced a grin, his shoulders twitched, a flicker of unease darting across his face. "Pour, old man," Caleb growled, lowering his voice, "or we'll pour lead into you." The saloon seemed to hold its breath. Boots creaked, dice lay forgotten, and the piano strings hummed faint from the slam of the door earlier. The air was thick with the weight of something about to break. Eli's hand drifted lower, brushing against the edge of a drawer built into the bar. A drawer no man in Red Rock had ever seen opened. The wood groaned faintly as his fingers pressed against it. The sound was quiet, yet it carried like thunder in the silence. The bandits leaned forward, their grins faltering, laughter dying in their throats. Townsfolk stared, caught between disbelief and dawning fear, as though they too sensed the shadow of something forgotten stirring in the bones of the men they'd all thought just a barkeep. The drawer creaked open. Caleb's hand shifted closer to his revolver, his voice suddenly rougher, edged with nerves. "What are you reaching for, old man?" Eli's face didn't move, didn't crack a smile or scowl, but the stillness in him was heavier than the mountains outside town. His fingers brushed against something hidden within, something wrapped in cloth, metal cool against his skin, waiting. The bandits leaned closer, breath-catching, the whole saloon bracing on the edge of a secret about to be unveiled. And the drawer slid wider, spilling shadow and the promise of violence into the smoky light of the Red Rock Saloon. Inside the drawer lay a revolver, polished, oiled, and swaddled in a strip of faded cloth. Eli's hand hovered over it, brushing the cool steel, feeling its old weight call to him like a ghost pressing against his ribs. For a long moment, the saloon seemed to lean in, every eye watching to see if the bartender would unwrap his secret. But his fingers withdrew. He pushed the drawer shut with a quiet click and lifted another glass from a counter instead, the rag in his hand smoothing it like nothing had changed. The bandits roared with laughter, slapping the bar and clapping each other's backs. Caleb leaned over the counter, his grin sharp and ugly. "That's what I thought," he spat, voice dripping with mockery. "Just a barkeep. Nothing more." The saloon filled with their cruel laughter. But not everyone joined in. In the corner, bent over his glass, old Jacob Miles muttered words so soft they were nearly carried away by the wind rattling the shutters. "Lord help us. I know that look. I seen it once before in Abilene." The sound was no louder than a prayer, but it found ears it should not have heard. A young deputy, fresh-faced and nervous in his too large badge, straightened for his chair near the door. His voice cracked as he asked, "What did you say, old-timer?" Jacob's eyes never left Eli, and his hands trembled against his cane. "I said, that ain't no barkeep. That's Eli Ironhand Turner." The word struck like a gunshot. Chairs scraped. Dice rolled from the table and clattered to the floor. Every gaze in the room swung back to the gray-haired bartender. The bandits froze mid-laugh, their grins faltering, eyes darting between one another and the men they had mocked only a moment before. Ironhand Turner. The name alone carried dust and blood with it. A gunslinger who, 2 decades ago, faced 3 hired killers in the streets of Santa Fe and walked away while their bodies lay cooling in the dirt. A man said to have put more notches in his Colt than most men lived years. Then, without a word, he vanished into smoke, leaving only tales whispered across campfires and poker tables. Caleb forced a bark of laughter, louder than it needed to be. "Fairy tales," he sneered, though his hand twitched against the grip of his pistol. "Ain't no way this old crow's him. Look at him. Bent back, soft hands, eyes half dead. Legends rot just like men." Eli set the polished glass down. He looked not at Caleb, nor at the bandits, but at the bottle of whiskey before him. His voice was low, steady as a river stone. "Names belong to the past. Tonight, I pour drinks." But the words did not soothe the room. Instead, they stirred it. The air thickened, something unseen coiling tight as a rattlesnake in the corner shadows. The townsfolk felt it, an edge, a presence long buried yet not gone. The bandits felt it too, though they'd never admit fear, their laughter thinning into nervous silence. Caleb sneered again, though sweat pricked at his temple. He turned to his men, trying to hold the reins of their carriage. "You hear that, boys? He says he's done. Says the legend's buried. Well," his grin widened like a wolf baring teeth, "maybe we'll dig him up. Maybe we'll make him remember." The outlaws spread out, boots grinding against the warp planks, hands settling near the butts of their pistols. The deputy at the back swallowed hard, his throat bobbing. His hand hovered near the revolver on his hip, but fear rooted him to the spot. To draw would be to step into a storm he wasn't built to weather. Eli lifted one more glass. His hand was steady now, far steadier than a moment ago. Too steady, the way a gunslinger's hand steadies when the world narrows down to the space between a trigger and a heartbeat. His eyes were cold, ancient with memory, yet his voice was almost gentle. "Careful," he said. Caleb's lip curled. "Why?" The silence stretched thin as wire. The lantern flame flickered. Eli set the glass down with a quiet finality, his words falling into the charged air like stones in a still pond. "Because men who force me to remember don't live long enough to forget." The sentence hung heavy, rattling against the bones of everyone present. For the first time, true fear darted across Caleb's eyes. His hand twitched toward the pistol at his side. The bandits shifted in tense unison, the deputy's breath caught, and the townsfolk froze where they sat, praying to be overlooked. And in that single heartbeat before violence, the saloon erupted in motion. The crack of gunfire split the saloon like lightning tearing the sky. In the same instant, Eli's hand came up from beneath the bar, the cloth falling away from polished steel that gleamed in the lamplight. The revolver barked twice, so quick and certain it seemed the echoes overlapped. 2 bandits staggered, eyes wide with disbelief, before crashing lifeless onto the floorboards. The saloon erupted in chaos. Chairs toppled as townsfolk scrambled for cover. Glass shattered, whiskey sprayed across the bar like liquid fire. Cards fluttered in the air where gamblers dove beneath tables. The piano shrieked a single note as a bullet smashed through its frame. Caleb cursed, rage twisting his face, and fired wildly toward the bar. His bullets tore through shelves, bottles exploding into shards in amber rain. Eli didn't flinch. He moved with the grim calm of a man who had lived too long with death, whose every step was measured, whose every shot carried judgment. He wasn't young anymore. His draw wasn't blinding speed. But what he lacked in swiftness, he answered with inevitability. Every time his revolver thundered, another man fell. God Almighty! The young deputy whispered from behind a tin table, his voice trembling as he watched the old barkeep cut through killers like wheat before a scythe. It is him. It's really him. A shot ripped through the haze, close enough to sting Eli's cheek. Another bandit lunged from the side, pistol raised. Eli turned, too late to dodge completely. Fire seared across his arm as a bullet grazed him, tearing cloth and flesh. He gritted his teeth but didn't falter. He pivoted, his revolver steady, and sent a round into the man's chest. The bandit crashed backward into a table, splintering it to kindling. The saloon choked with smoke and the acrid stench of spent powder. Screams and curses blended with the ringing in every ear. Eli's revolver barked again, then again, his every movement born of instinct honed in 100 dusty duels under hotter suns. The bandits who moments earlier laughed at him now lay sprawled across the floorboards, their pistols still clutched in lifeless hands. Then, silence. Only Caleb Veric remained, crouched behind an overturned chair, chest heaving, sweat beading at his temple. His eyes darted through the haze, fury and fear warring in his gaze. "You son of a," his voice broke, strangled by disbelief. "You ain't supposed to still be alive." Eli stood in the settling smoke, blood streaking his sleeve, his revolver hanging steady at his side. His voice cut through the silence, cold as winter on the plains. "You should have left me to pour whiskey." Caleb's jaw clenched. He rose a fraction from cover, eyes blazing, but instead of firing, he turned. Like a jackal smelling fire, he bolted for the batwing doors. His boots slammed against the boards, his coat flaring as he vanished into the night. Eli didn't raise his weapon. He watched him go, unmoving, his silence heavier than gunfire. The townsfolk peeked out one by one, faces pale and wide-eyed. They saw the bodies strewn across the saloon, smoke curling upward like ghosts toward the rafters. They saw the bartender, quiet Eli, standing with blood on his arm and a revolver still warm in his grasp. Jacob Miles, the old rancher, crossed himself with trembling hands. "Iron Hand Turner," he muttered. "By God above, it truly is him." Eli holstered his revolver with deliberate calm, sliding it back into its worn leather as though placing a memory into a grave. He leaned against the bar, his breath measured, though his arm burned where blood seeped through his sleeve. The deputy rose, limping from his cover. He stared at Eli with awe and unease, as if seeing a ghost made flesh. "Mr. Turner, sir, what happens now?" Eli's eyes darkened, shadow swallowing whatever softness remained in them. He looked not at the deputy but at the doorway where Caleb had fled. His words were heavy with certainty. Now he'll come back. With more. He won't rest till he buries me, and anyone standing in Red Rock. The deputy's stomach sank. Around the room, the townsfolk exchanged fearful glances. They had just seen the bartender turn into a legend, and yet the cost of it pressed down on them already. The bodies on the floor were not the end, they were only the beginning. Outside, the night carried Caleb's curse into the wind. He swung himself into the saddle, his face twisted with rage and humiliation. He raised his fist to the stars, swearing loud enough for the town to hear. "I'll bring 50 men, and we'll burn this town to ash." His horse reared, hooves striking sparks from the dirt, and then he was gone, swallowed into the darkness, leaving only the echo of his oath hanging over Red Rock like the promise of a storm. By dawn, the air in Red Rock carried more than dust. It carried whispers of doom. Word spread swift as prairie fire. Caleb Veric had ridden for reinforcements, a gang near 50 strong, men who lived for blood and plunder. They would come before the sun set, and the town had hours, maybe less. The deputy rang the church bell, pulling every soul from their beds, from fields, from porches. The townsfolk gathered in the square, faces pale, eyes shifting like spook cattle. Fear divided them. Some shouted to pack wagons and flee into the hills. Others clenched fists, insisting they'd stand their ground. Old Jacob Miles leaned on his cane, voice hoarse but steady. "If Eli Turner's truly back," he said, "maybe the Lord gave us a fighting chance." Eli himself sat apart, outside the saloon, revolver disassembled across the table. His hands moved slow, cleaning, oiling, reassembling with ritual calm. For a long while, he listened to the arguments without lifting his gaze. Then he spoke, his voice carrying quiet authority. "I never wanted this. But if Red Rock falls, it won't be because I stayed silent." The murmurs died. Men and women alike turned toward him. He holstered the revolver, rose to his feet, and for the first time in 20 years, Iron Hand Turner did not hide. Through the morning, he drilled them. Farmers who knew more of plows than pistols learned how to steady their aim. Blacksmiths with arms thick from iron were shown how to brace a rifle against their shoulders. Saloon girls who'd never held more than a tray practiced thumbing cartridges into chambers. Eli moved among them like a general forged of iron and patience, his calmness cutting through panic, his voice a tether to hold against despair. "Wait. Aim. Breathe. Fire." The rhythm steadied their hands. Wagons were dragged into the street, overturned to form barricades. Barrels, crates, and broken fences became cover. The smith hammered iron into spikes to halt charging horses. Buckets of water lined rooftops against fire. By noon, the town no longer looked like Red Rock. It looked like a fortress born of desperation. But no matter how high their courage rose, unease gnawed at them all. Dust clouds on the horizon announced the coming storm. By evening, it grew thick, rising like smoke. Then came the sound, hooves pounding, rifles gleaming in the sinking sun, voices howling wild. Caleb Veric rode at their head, eyes burning, coat whipping like a banner of vengeance. He had kept his word. He had brought a horde. The townsfolk braced behind wagons and fences, hearts in their throats. Eli stood at the center, revolver loose at his side, eyes cold as granite. The wind carried the stink of horses and gun oil, the cry of men eager for ruin. The first shots rang out. Rifles cracked, bullets whistled, wood splintered, glass shattered. A window burst into shards as a shot tore through it. A barrel exploded into staves. Dust filled the air, choking lungs. The townsfolk fired back, clumsy at first, shots going wide, nerves rattling. But Eli's voice carried steady, slicing through panic like a bell. "Wait. Aim. Breathe. Fire." This time, bullets struck true. A rider pitched from his saddle, his scream lost in the thunder. Another toppled sideways, boot caught in his stirrup, dragged through the dirt by his horse. The bandits howled, circling like wolves around a herd, gunfire rattling the walls of every home. Caleb's rage cut over the din, his voice carrying like a curse. "Burn the place. Burn it to the ground." Torches flared to life, their flames bright against the darkening sky. The gang surged, charging with fire raised high. Women screamed, children sobbed, the barricades trembled under the force of hoof and flame. But Eli was already moving. He strode to the saloon's doorway, revolver gleaming in the half-light. The smoke curled around him, making him look carved from the night itself. He raised his gun and fired. One rider fell, torch spinning into the dirt. He fired again. Another man tumbled before his fire could kiss wood. The doorway became his battlefield, the saloon his fortress. "If you want fire," Eli said, voice carrying clear above the chaos, "you'll have to cross mine." The bandits reeled, their rush faltering as their torches fell to the ground. Horses screamed, men cursed. But Caleb pressed harder, his fury blinding. "Take him. Rush the saloon. Tear him down." Gunfire lit the street, flashes bursting through the smoke. Eli fired again and again, dropping men before they touched the porch. But then the crack of a rifle split sharper than the rest. A bullet slammed near his chest, driving him back against the doorframe. He staggered, blood blooming across his shirt, knees threatening to buckle. The townsfolk cried out, terror seizing them as their last pillar seemed to falter. Caleb's roar cut through the night like a blade, his voice savage. "Now, rush him. Rush the saloon." The bandits surged, torches blazing, hoofs thundering, shadows swallowing the street. Eli pressed a hand against his wound, forcing himself upright. His revolver lifted once more, eyes burning through the haze. And the storm crashed against Red Rock's walls. Eli pressed his hand to his side, feeling the warmth of his own blood soaking through his shirt. The bullet had cut deep, but it had not yet broken him. He stayed upright, leaning into the doorframe of the saloon, revolver steady in his other hand. The world around him was chaos, gunfire hammering like drums of war, shouts and screams tangled with the neighing of terrified horses, smoke rising thick enough to turn the evening into a choking night. Still, he did not bend. The townsfolk fought with the desperation of people who knew there was no other tomorrow but this one. Farmers crouched behind overturned wagons, their hands trembling as they fired into the oncoming swarm. The blacksmith roared as he swung his hammer against a rider who came too close, toppling both man and beast. Women who had poured drinks hours ago now crouched on rooftops, pulling triggers with wide eyes and teeth clenched, sending shots into the dark tide that pressed against them. The siege dragged into the night. The air smelled of gunpowder and charred wood, every breath burned in the throat. Fire lit the street in fits and starts as torches flew, catching hay bales, wagon wheels, and finally the saloon itself. Flames licked the roof, glowing orange against the stars. Between volleys, the gunfire fell to a hush broken only by the moans of the wounded. Through the dust and smoke, Caleb's voice rang out, sharp as a whip. "You can't stop us, old man. You ain't Iron Hand no more. You're just a ghost with a gun." The townsfolk glanced toward Eli, waiting, fearful. He stepped forward, blood running down his side, and raised his voice so that it carried to every ear, strong and unshaken. "Then you best fear the ghost." The words rippled through the air, heavier than any bullet. Even the bandits hesitated before they spurred their mounts again. The charge came, thunderous, relentless. Eli lifted his revolver and fired until it clicked empty, each shot cutting down a rider who dared come near. When the cylinder spun dry, the deputy, blood on his leg, face pale with pain, dragged himself forward and threw a rifle into Eli's hand. "Use it," he cried, before collapsing against the barricade. Eli caught the rifle, shouldered it, and fired with a marksman's certainty. He picked them off one after another, his gray hair catching the glow of firelight until he looked carved from steel and flame. Each pull of the trigger was precise, unhurried, final. But the cost grew with every breath. Townsfolk screamed as bullets found them. The blacksmith stumbled, clutching his chest. A young boy who had loaded rifles with trembling hands was dragged away bleeding by his mother. The deputy groaned, clutching at his leg, struggling to reload. And in the midst of it, Jacob Miles slumped against a wall, whispering prayers with cracked lips, his cane fallen in the dirt. The saloon roared with fire, smoke billowing as the roof timbers began to groan. Eli glanced back once, his heart tightening at the sight of the only place he had called his refuge turning to cinders. He whispered low, words for himself alone. "I never wanted to be Iron Hand again, but maybe that's all I ever was." He reloaded the rifle with the last cartridges left to him, hands moving with grim purpose, his eyes fixed on the rider who commanded the horde. Caleb Veric, coat whipping behind him, teeth bared in a predator's grin, raising his rifle high. Caleb had wanted this moment as much as Eli. It was not just vengeance, it was a duel, written in fire and blood, the kind the frontier never forgot. Eli's chest rose with a steady breath. Caleb pulled his horse forward, rifle sight trained steady on the old gunslinger. Across the smoke and ruin, two men locked eyes. One born of rage, the other of weary resolve. Both men fired. The night held its breath as the crack of rifles rolled over the town, louder than the flames, louder than the screams. Smoke drifted thick, curling between them, cloaking the street in shadow and sparks. For a heartbeat, nothing moved, no voice cried out. Then the smoke cleared, and only one figure remained standing. Caleb Veric tumbled backward out of his saddle, the crack of Eli's rifle still echoing when his body struck the dirt. He was dead before the dust settled, his eyes wide, his lips frozen mid-curse. For a moment, the battlefield went still. His gang, so fierce a heartbeat earlier, faltered as though the spine had been ripped from them. Their leader lay broken in the street, and with him went their fire. Some dropped their weapons outright, hands raised in trembling surrender. Others wheeled their horses and fled into the night, spearing hard to outrun the shadow of what they had just witnessed. The few who lingered looked lost, confused, waiting for orders that would never come. Red Rock held. But Eli Turner staggered back from the doorway of the burning saloon, his hand pressed tight against his side. Blood seeped between his fingers, dark and heavy, staining his shirt and dripping into the thirsty earth. The rifle slipped from his grasp, clattering to the wood as his knees gave way. The townsfolk cried out, breaking from cover now that the danger had passed. They rushed to him, the deputy first, limping hard but unwilling to let the men who had saved them fall alone. The young deputy dropped to his knees beside Eli, seizing his hand. "Don't leave us, sir," he pleaded, voice cracking, eyes wide with desperation. "We need you. The town needs you." Eli's lips curved into the faintest of smiles, his breath shallow but steady. "No," he whispered, his voice a rasp of wind over stone. "You don't need me. You proved you can fight. This town belongs to its people." The deputy shook his head, tears burning in his eyes. Around them, townsfolk knelt, hands reaching for Eli's shoulders, murmuring his name as though prayer alone might bind him to the earth a while longer. The saloon behind him roared in flames, sparks snapping like fireflies rising into the night sky. Eli's gaze shifted toward it, the light of the inferno reflecting in his eyes. "Guess I won't be pouring whiskey no more," he murmured. His voice carried both sorrow and peace, the weight of a man who had found his final reckoning. The deputy's grip tightened. "You'll always be remembered," he swore, his voice firm though his tears spilled freely. "I'll make sure of it. We all will." Eli drew one last breath, ragged and thin. He forced his eyes to stay open, to look at the faces around him, the same faces that had once seen him only as a tired barkeep, now seeing the truth of who he had been all along. With what strength he had left, he whispered words that felt carved for eternity, words that would echo long after the fire burned out. "Tell them." The bandits laughed at the bartender. But they didn't know. He was a retired gunslinger legend. The final word left him like smoke from a dying fire. His chest rose once more, then stilled. His hand slackened in the deputy's grasp. His eyes closed, and with him, silence fell over Red Rock. Only the crackle of flames dared to speak. The townsfolk bowed their heads. Some wept openly, others pressed their hats to their hearts. The deputy lingered at Eli's side, unable to let go. The old rancher Jacob Miles whispered a prayer, his voice trembling as he called Eli by the name he had once abandoned, Iron Hand Turner. Dawn found the town weary and broken but alive. The fire had burned through the night, devouring the saloon until only blackened beams and smoking ash remained. Where whiskey had flowed and laughter once carried, there was now only ruin. Yet amid that ruin, Red Rock endured. They buried their dead on the hill beyond the church, the rising sun casting gold across the fresh mounds. When it came time for Eli, the townsfolk gathered as one. There were no fine stones, no polished markers, only a simple wooden board, carved by the deputy's shaking hand, planted firmly in the earth above him. The words read clear and proud. Iron Hand Turner, he poured courage when the west was dry. The townsfolk lingered there long after the grave was covered. Some laid flowers, others laid hats, tokens of respect for a man they had never truly known until the end. Children stared wide-eyed, committing his name to memory. The deputy stood watchful, vowing silently that no one would forget what had been given for their survival. And in the years that followed, they did not forget. Travelers passing through Red Rock would hear the story told by firelight in the saloon rebuilt upon the same ground. Old-timers would lean close, lowering their voices as though speaking sacred truth. They spoke of the night the bandits came like a storm, of the bartender who revealed himself not as a frail man behind a counter but as Iron Hand Turner, the legend who had once vanished into dust only to return when the town needed him most. They told of how he fought with unerring calm, how he steadied trembling hands and hearts, how his final stand saved Red Rock from being burned from the map. They told of the words he left behind, words that rang like iron in the ears of anyone who listened. Asterisk, men who force me to remember don't live long enough to forget. Asterisk. And always, the story ended the same way, with the final truth carved not in stone but in memory. Bandits had laughed at the bartender. They had mocked him, threatened him, thought him nothing but a relic. But they hadn't known the truth, and they paid with their lives for their ignorance. Bandits laughed at the bartender, the storytellers would say, letting the firelight catch in their eyes, their voices low and certain, not knowing he was a retired gunslinger legend.